Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into the final goodbye. Mrs. Lan agrees to meet Lin one last time behind glass, and what happens next will decide whether Lin disappears forever or keeps haunting this family. Will Tieu Uri and Uri finally lock the door for good? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that felt safe. It was the kind of quiet that made you listen for footsteps that weren't there. Mrs. Lan sat on the sofa with a blanket over her shoulders, staring at her phone like it might explode. Her fingers hovered over the screen, trembling, then pulling back, then hovering again. Tieu Uri walked in from the kitchen and stopped the moment she saw her mother's face. "Mum? What's wrong?" Mrs. Lan swallowed hard. "It's Lin." Tieu Uri's spine stiffened. Uri stepped in behind her, immediately reading the room. He didn't ask loudly. He didn't snatch the phone. He simply moved closer, present enough that Tieu Uri didn't feel alone with her fear. Mrs. Lan's voice cracked. She sent a message. She said, "She wants to see me one last time." Tieu Uri's heart dropped to her stomach. A last time was the most dangerous phrase in a family like this, because it sounded like closure, but it often became a door. "Mum," Tieu Uri said slowly, "we already gave her mercy." "I know," Mrs. Lan whispered, "but I can't sleep. I keep hearing her voice. I keep thinking, what if something happens to her and I never—" Tieu Uri's eyes stung with frustration and grief at the same time. She wasn't angry at her mother. She was angry at what Lin had planted inside her. Uri spoke softly, careful with every word. "Auntie," he dared, "if you need a goodbye, we do it the right way." Mrs. Lan looked up. "The right way?" Uri nodded. "Not at home, not alone. We meet where there are witnesses, and after that, we sign a no-contact agreement so this can end for real." Tieu Uri's breath caught. "No contact." Mrs. Lan's face crumpled. "That means I can't even—" "It means she can't reach you," Tieu Uri said, voice shaking, "and pull you back in." Mrs. Lan began to cry, quietly, like she didn't want to admit how deep her attachment still went. "I raised her," Mrs. Lan whispered. "I raised her like my own." Tieu Uri knelt in front of her mother, taking her hands. "And you have a daughter sitting right here," she whispered. "I'm not asking you to hate her. I'm asking you to stop bleeding for her." Uri remained steady behind Tieu Uri. "We can do one last supervised meeting," he said, "but after that we close everything." Mrs. Lan looked between them, shaking. Then she nodded once. "Okay," she whispered. "One last time." Tieu Uri's throat tightened. "We go today," she said, because she knew if they waited, Mrs. Lan's fear would grow into 1,000 excuses. The local office wasn't intimidating in a dramatic way. It was worse. It was normal. Plastic chairs, a counter, a bright fan, paperwork trays. The kind of place where life-changing things happened quietly while other people waited for stamps. An investigator greeted them, calm and professional. Uri spoke first, voice clear. "Mrs. Lan needs closure, but we also need safety. We're requesting a supervised final contact and a no-contact agreement afterward." The investigator nodded. "That's possible," he said. "Given the history, it's recommended." Mrs. Lan's fingers trembled in her lap. Tieu Uri leaned closer. "Mum, look at me," she whispered. "You can do this." Mrs. Lan nodded, but her eyes were wet. The investigator continued. "To be clear, a no-contact condition means Lin cannot call, message, visit your home, approach you privately, or attempt to contact through others. Violation escalates consequences." Mrs. Lan flinched as if the words were a slap. Tieu Uri felt a wave of guilt hit her, but she forced herself not to drown in it. She reminded herself, kindness without boundaries was how Lin had ruled this house. The investigator looked at Mrs. Lan. "Are you requesting this condition?" Mrs. Lan hesitated. Tieu Uri held her breath. Uri didn't push. He only said quietly, "Auntie, this is for your peace, for your health." Mrs. Lan closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with a trembling determination. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm requesting it." Tieu Tieu's chest loosened as if a rope inside her had finally been cut. The investigator nodded. "We'll proceed. Lin is here today to sign conditions. We can allow a final supervised conversation." Mrs. Lan's lips parted. "She's here?" Tieu Tieu swallowed. "Okay," she said, voice firm because fear loved hesitation. Uri stepped slightly closer to Tieu Tieu, not touching but anchoring. "Remember," he murmured, "we leave with closure, not with a new wound." Tieu Tieu nodded. They were led to a small visitation room with a glass divider. Not because Lin was a monster, because procedure existed to prevent people from becoming monsters again. When Lin walked in, Tieu Tieu barely recognized her. No vest, no bright lipstick, no sharp smile. Her face looked thinner. Her eyes were tired, red around the edges like she'd been crying for days. She held the phone with both hands like it was the only thing keeping her upright. For a second, Lin's gaze flicked to Uri, then to Tieu Tieu, then finally to Mrs. Lan, and something in her expression changed, like she suddenly remembered how to be a daughter. "Mom," Lin's voice broke. "You came." Mrs. Lan lifted the phone with trembling hands. Tears ran down her cheeks immediately. "Why did you do it?" Mrs. Lan whispered. "Why did you make me afraid of my own child?" Lin swallowed hard. "I was desperate," she whispered. "I thought, if I lost my place in the family, I'd lose everything." Tieu Tieu's jaw tightened. Uri's expression didn't change. He didn't glare. He didn't threaten. He simply watched, alert, like a guard at the edge of a cliff. Mrs. Lan shook her head, crying. "You hurt me. You hurt Tieu Tieu." Lin nodded quickly. I know, I'm sorry." Mrs. Lan's voice trembled. "Sorry doesn't fix it." "I know," Lin whispered again, softer. "That's why. I'm here to accept whatever comes next." Tieu Tieu blinked. Because that was new. Or at least, it sounded new. Mrs. Lan wiped her face with shaky fingers. "Lin," she whispered, "I raised you. I loved you. But I cannot protect you by hurting my daughter anymore." Lin's lips trembled. She pressed her hand to the glass as if she could crawl back into the past. "I don't want you to abandon me," Lin sobbed. Mrs. Lan's shoulders shook. "I'm not abandoning you. I'm letting you go." Those words landed in the room like a final stamp. Tieu Tieu's throat burned. She realized she'd waited her whole life to hear her mother say something like that. Not because she wanted Lin to suffer, but because she wanted her own place to finally be safe. Mrs. Lan continued, voice breaking but steady. "From today, you will not contact me privately anymore." Lin froze. Tieu Tieu felt her heart slam, because now the line was visible, and Lin hated visible lines. "What?" Lin whispered, eyes widening. "Mum?" Mrs. Lan swallowed. "It's the condition." Lin's gaze flicked to Tieu Tieu, sharp, wounded, resentful for half a second before she forced it back into tears. "Tieu Tieu," Lin whispered into the phone, "you're really doing this?" Tieu Tieu's voice came out low and calm because she refused to give Lin the emotional explosion she wanted. "Yes," Tieu Tieu said, "and this is the last time we talk like this." Lin's face crumpled. "I said I'm sorry." Tieu Tieu held her gaze through the glass. "And I said I heard you. Mercy doesn't mean you return." Uri spoke then, quiet but final. "You got a second chance," he said. "Don't waste it trying to reach back into this house." Lin stared at him, eyes wet, still wanting something she would never get. Then she lowered her head. "I understand," Lin whispered. Mrs. Lan wiped her tears again. "Live properly, Lin. Please." Lin pressed her palm to the glass, then slowly pulled it away. She didn't say another dramatic line. She just nodded, small and broken, and sat back. Tieu Tieu's hands were shaking, but Yuri's presence behind her steadied her breathing. The investigator opened the door slightly. "Time." Mrs. Lan whispered into the phone one last time, voice barely there. "Goodbye, Lin." And for the first time, Tieu Tieu felt the goodbye wasn't a threat. It was a release. After the visitation, the investigator guided them back to the main office. Mrs. Lan looked like her legs might give out. Tieu Tieu supported her gently, and Uri walked on her other side, silent and solid. At the desk, Linh was already seated with a stack of documents in front of her. She didn't look up when they entered. Her shoulders were tense, like she was holding herself inside her own skin. The investigator spoke clearly, professionally. "We are finalising the no-contact condition requested by Mrs. Lan. Linh, you will sign acknowledgement. If you violate it, directly or indirectly, there will be consequences." Lin's fingers hovered above the pen. Tieu Tieu watched her carefully. This was the moment Linh could still try to twist things. She could refuse and blame Tieu Tieu. She could cry and beg, she could throw a tantrum, but the room was too bright for performances to hide in. Mrs. Lan spoke softly, almost pleading. "Linh, please sign, let this end." Lin's eyes flicked up just once to Mrs. Lan. They were red and hollow. Then Linh looked at Tieu Tieu. A long stare, not hatred, not love. Something like loss mixed with pride. "Fine," Linh whispered. She picked up the pen and signed. The investigator pointed to each line as he read it aloud. No phone calls, no messages, no showing up at the home, no asking others to contact, no approaching in public, no private meetings. Each sentence felt like a door locking, and for Tieu Tieu, that lock didn't feel like revenge. It felt like oxygen. The investigator added, "Due to the supervision conditions, Linh will also be relocated to a different area under monitoring for a period of time." Mrs. Lan gasped softly, tears filling again. Lin's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Tieu Tieu felt a weird ache, because even when someone harms you, seeing them lose everything is not a clean kind of satisfaction. It's messy. It's human. The investigator looked at Mrs. Lan. "Mrs. Lan, do you understand and agree to enforce this boundary? No exceptions." Mrs. Lan's lips trembled. Tieu Tieu's chest tightened again, waiting for the softness. Then Mrs. Lan surprised her. She nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "No exceptions." Tieu Tieu's eyes filled. Not because she wanted her mother to become cold, but because she wanted her mother to become safe. The investigator stood. "That's all. This meeting is concluded." Linh remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the table. Then she stood slowly. She didn't walk toward Mrs. Lan. Procedure kept her distance. She didn't run toward Uri. His presence was a wall. She looked at Tieu Tieu instead, like she finally understood the real center of this family wasn't Mrs. Lan. It was the bond between mother and daughter. Lin's voice came out quiet. "Tieu Tieu, I can't undo what I did." Tieu Tieu's expression stayed steady. "No," she said. "You can't." Linh swallowed. "But I'm going to stop." Uri's voice cut in calmly. "Then stop completely." Linh nodded once. Mrs. Lan whispered, almost choking, "Take care of yourself." Lin's eyes glistened. She didn't answer with "Mom" again, like she knew that word could drag Mrs. Lan backward. She simply bowed her head slightly. Then she turned and walked away with the officer assigned to escort her. That was it. No dramatic scream, no revenge vow. Just footsteps fading down a corridor, and for the first time in a long time, those footsteps didn't chase Tieu Tieu's heart. Outside, the sunlight felt too bright. Mrs. Lan looked up at the sky, blinking like she had to relearn how to exist without constant tension. Tieu Tieu stood beside her, breathing slowly, trying not to collapse from the delayed release of adrenaline. Uri spoke quietly, "Let's go home." On the drive back, Mrs. Lan didn't speak much. She only whispered once, voice trembling, "I feel like I lost a child." Tieu Tieu's eyes stung, but she reached out and held her mother's hand in the car. "You didn't lose me," Tieu Tieu whispered. "I'm here." Mrs. Lan nodded, crying quietly. "I know." Uri drove with both hands on the wheel, jaw tight, not with anger, but with the weight of watching the women he loved finally close a door that should have never been open this wide. When they arrived home, Uri didn't let the moment drift. He went straight to the door and checked the lock. Then he looked at Tieu Tieu. "We change it today." Tieu Tieu blinked. "Today?" Uri nodded. "Not because we're scared," he said, "because we're done." Mrs. Lan watched, trembling. "Is that necessary?" Tieu Tieu stepped closer to her mother, voice gentle. "Mum, this is how we tell our bodies we're safe." Uri called a locksmith. While they waited, Uri pulled out a folder, copies of the revocation papers, medical notes, and the notary stamped documents. "We'll keep one set here," he said. "One set with my mother's legal office and one digital copy encrypted." Tieu Tieu exhaled. "You already planned all that." Uri's voice was simple. "I'm not letting paper become a weapon again." Mrs. Lan stared at the documents like they were snakes. "I was so stupid." Tieu Tieu shook her head, firm. "No, Mom, you were manipulated, and you're fixing it now." The locksmith arrived. In less than an hour, the lock was replaced. The sound of the final click felt like a ceremony. Uri handed Mrs. Lan a new key. Mrs. Lan stared at it, tears sliding down her cheeks. Tieu Tieu asked softly, "What are you feeling?" Mrs. Lan whispered, "Sad." Tieu Tieu nodded. "That's allowed." Mrs. Lan looked up at Tieu Tieu, voice breaking, but also relieved. Tieu Tieu's throat burned, because relief was the emotion she'd been begging for so long. Uri then took out Mrs. Lan's old phone and set it on the table. "We changed the number," he said, "and we set the contact list. Only safe numbers, no unknown calls." Mrs. Lan hesitated, then nodded. Tieu Tieu did the steps with her mother, slowly, like a ritual of reclaiming control. When it was done, Mrs. Lan looked exhausted. Uri glanced at Tieu Tieu. "Tonight," he said gently, "we eat something warm, something normal." In the kitchen, Uri rolled up his sleeves. Tieu Tieu washed rice. The sound of water running felt strangely peaceful. Mrs. Lan sat at the table, watching them move around each other without tension. Uri chopped vegetables with steady hands. Tieu Tieu stirred a pot, tasting, adjusting. For a while, nobody said Lin's name. Nobody had to, because the ending had been written not in anger, but in structure, boundaries, paperwork, locks, a goodbye that didn't leave cracks. Tieu Tieu glanced at Uri. "Do you think she'll try again?" Uri's answer was calm. "Not with the same access." Tieu Tieu swallowed. "And if my mum misses her?" Uri looked toward Mrs. Lan, then back to Tieu Tieu. "Then we hold your mother gently," he said, "but we don't reopen doors." Tieu Tieu nodded. Mrs. Lan whispered from the table, voice small, "I'll miss her." Tieu Tieu walked to her mother and hugged her from behind. "I know," Tieu Tieu whispered, "but you're not alone." Mrs. Lan covered Tieu Tieu's hands with hers. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not leaving me." Tieu Tieu's eyes filled again. "I wanted to," she admitted softly, "but I didn't." Uri brought the soup to the table and set it down, steam rising between them like a warm curtain. "Eat," he said gently. "We need strength for the new chapter." Tieu Tieu sat down beside Uri. Mrs. Lan lifted her spoon slowly, then took a bite. Her shoulders relaxed, not all at once, but enough. And in that small, ordinary movement, Tieu Tieu felt it. Lin's chapter wasn't ending because Lin disappeared. It was ending because this house finally learned how to close the door, together. Mrs. Lan receives a final message from Lin asking to meet one last time, and Tieu Tieu fears that goodbye could become a new doorway for manipulation. Uri insists on doing it the right way. A supervised meeting at the local office, with witnesses and strict boundaries. Behind the glass, Mrs. Lan breaks down, but finally says the words she's avoided for too long. She loves Lin, yet she must let her go to protect Tieu Tieu and herself. Lin pleads, but Tieu Tieu stays calm and makes it clear, mercy doesn't mean return. After the visit, Lin signs a formal no-contact agreement. No calls, no messages, no visits, and no indirect contact, then is relocated under supervision. Back home, Uri changes the locks, secures the paperwork, and helps Mrs. Lan change her phone number. The episode ends with a quiet dinner, signalling a new chapter built on safety, structure, and healing.